Hey everyone, I'm feeling a bit under the weather, so class is going to run a little different today. You should have your assignment sheet printed out and put in your binder, as well as the notes on the story of the Crusades and a blank map. You will need a highlighter and a yellow colored pencil, a red colored pencil, a blue colored pencil, and a pen, but you can grab those later at the end of the show. So again, this keynote will walk you through class. If one of your classmates is having trouble with the keynote presentation, you are more than welcome to share. Just make sure you are out in the hallway and working. Anything you do not finish in class is due tomorrow for homework. Thank you. All right, let's begin. So our question of the day is, why did the Crusades happen? And on Friday, we did an activity where you got to experience sort of the overall gist of a crusade. So now we're going to look at the actual historical crusades. Some of them are pretty crazy. But first, I would like to review. So for this, I'd like you to quiz yourself on the following information. So I will ask you 3 questions. You do not need to write anything down, but see if you can answer the following questions. The slideshow will move on after I give you some time to think about each question. So here's the first one. Name 2 reasons Crusaders went to Jerusalem. All right, so some reasons Crusaders went on a crusade to the Holy Land was, first, the Pope promised them that they would get into heaven no matter what sins they had committed. If they died on the crusade, it didn't matter if they had murdered someone or committed adultery or stole, their sins would be forgiven and they would get into heaven, which for the peasants at the time was a pretty big deal. The other thing is that the Pope promised them that they would become very wealthy and they would get land from the Crusades. So for many peasants and lesser nobles, this was a pretty big deal because they could increase their status and wealth in Europe. And there are some other reasons which we'll get into later, but those are kind of the big ones why individual people wanted to go on crusades. All right, name 2 difficulties Crusaders encountered along the way. All right, some difficulties. First, Crusaders had to deal with horrible maps and they often became lost. Some Crusaders never even made it to the Holy Land because their maps were so bad. Second, Crusaders had to deal with highway robbers and people attacking them along their journey. And third, most Crusaders had to walk all the way from Europe to the Holy Land, which took a very long time. It was several hundred miles. They walked at about 3 miles per day, so it could take almost 2 years to walk from Europe to the Holy Land, depending on where you started in Europe, and if you didn't get lost. All right, and last but not least, name 2 things Crusaders brought back to Europe from the Holy Land. I really want to sing the Jeopardy theme song for you guys, but my voice sucks, so. All right, so Crusaders brought a lot of stuff back to Europe from the Middle East. First, they brought better, accurate maps. The Muslims had pretty advanced system for recording geography and the land around them, so Europeans were able to bring that back. They also brought back the accurate compass, which the Muslims had perfected. The Muslims had preserved books by Greek and Roman philosophers, which focused on logic and reason, so Crusaders brought those books back, which started off the Renaissance in the spring for us. Europeans also gained better knowledge. For example, they learned about algebra, astronomy, medicine, anything the Muslims were advanced in, the Europeans brought back to Europe. And last but not least, they also brought back spices and silks, which became all the rage in medieval Europe. All right, so for the next bit, we're going to do notes. Make sure you grab your highlighter and the notes called The Story of the Crusades that you printed at the beginning of class. And obviously, I expect you to hole punch this at the end of the notes and put this in your binder when you are done with the slideshow. Right? All right, moving on. So this is the story of the Crusades, and here we have a lovely map of some of the routes that Crusaders took, and many Crusades happened over 200 years, and we'll get into that story, and that'll be part of your reading for tonight. So, also, I haven't figured out how to use annotations, so just highlight, I'll read each bullet point, highlight each bullet point, and then I'll explain it, and then we'll move on to the next one. Also, the numbering was not cooperating, so each slide starts over with the numbering, but I think you guys can figure out where we are on the notes. All right. So, in 1076, the Muslim Turks seized Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and the Muslim Turks had slowly been taking over land in the Middle East. They were one group of Muslims. They had actually converted to Islam, and they were just slowly growing more powerful. Now, the Turks treated Christians poorly, and this wasn't all Turks. This is just occasionally a Turkish leader would have policies or rules that did not treat Christians very well, and would allow for Christian churches to be destroyed or Christians to be discriminated against. Again, not all Muslims, just a few, but it was enough to sort of spread rumors back to Europe. So, number 3, the Pope called on all European Christians to go on a holy crusade to recapture the Holy Land for Christianity. This is why on Friday I put on my Pope hat and read the fiery speech to you guys. The Pope was hoping to save the Holy Land and keep it open for Christians to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem, which they had been doing for many years, and they were worried that the rise in power of the Turkish Muslims would stop them from going on going on pilgrimages to the Holy Land. All right. So there were many reasons why people joined the Crusades. First, they believed it was the right thing to do. They wanted to help their Christian brothers in the Middle East and the Holy Land. The Pope told them it was the right thing to do. Second, and this was probably one of the more appealing things, the Pope told them that if they went, all of their sins would be forgiven. So this is a very, 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 very big carrot on a stick if you were a peasant or someone who believed you had committed a sin and you thought, well, if I go on a crusade, I'll be forgiven, I'll get into heaven. Remember, that was a very big deal for people in the Middle Ages because their peasant lives sucked so much. C, it sounded exciting. If you think about it, there were a lot of knights and soldiers in the Middle Ages, and they liked adventure. They liked fighting, and this had a very promising thing for adventure. So a lot of Crusaders just thought it would be exciting. And last but not least, they also thought they might gain riches and glory. Another big motivator for many Europeans to go on a crusade. A lot of peasants and lesser nobles wanted to get wealthy and get land and come back famous and wealthy. So that was a big motivator. All right. Again, there were a number of crusades. The first crusade was the most successful one. So the Crusaders captured cities in Turkey and Syria and eventually captured Jerusalem, which is the capital of the Holy Land. And they were able to hold it for a very long time. But everything after that sort of failed. And on this map, you can see a lot of the Crusader routes, and I'm going to show another one. So this is the map of the First Crusade. Obviously, lots of different Europeans came from all over Europe to the Holy Land, which is where the Holy Land is on the bottom right of the screen, where all of the little red arrows end up. All right, so in that first crusade, when the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, they massacred almost everyone in the city. So anyone they didn't massacre, they sold into slavery. Lots of looting and pillaging in the city. And then once they had captured Jerusalem, they set up a Crusader kingdom, and for the next 80 years they ruled the Holy Land. So they set up a couple of different Crusader kingdoms. Most of the Crusaders ended up going back to Europe, but a few stayed to sort of run the Holy Land. And the reason they were so successful that first time is because the Muslims weren't very united or organized. There were lots of different groups of Muslims. They had sort of been living in times of conflicts and peace off and on. But when the Christians first came, they weren't very organized. All right. However, after that first crusade, the Muslims became better organized and they were able to unite and fight back. So there was a second crusade to try to defeat the Muslims again. This crusade failed. There were several other crusades. None of them was successful. There were a couple of famous ones. There was the King's Crusade, which was the third crusade. And that's the one where, if you have heard of a guy named Richard the Lionheart, he was one of the kings to lead that. And then there's another crusade called the Children's Crusade, because obviously the Europeans had lost the Holy Land and they were getting a little bit desperate, and they thought, well, we'll send the children because they're innocent and pure and God will protect them. Most of those children ended up in either slavery or they disappeared. A few of them were able to make it home, but you can imagine hundreds of thousands of children walking from France and Germany to the Holy Land will not end up well. All right, so this goes off and on for about 200 years of fighting, and the Christians finally give up in 1291. So the Muslims retained control of the Holy Land and the city of Jerusalem.